Hello, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, the murder trial of the German neo-Nazi group has many wondering how the group went undetected for so long. Our digital producer Malika Bilal is here looking out for your live feedback. And Malika, this subject about extremist groups in Germany, it's generated a lot of conversation online. What are people saying?
Definitely, it's definitely struck a nerve with people. And so we're having lots of comments from Germany, but also other places, people cautioning against singling Germany out. So we asked the question, has Germany reached a post-racial society, or is there still work to be done? Qasim Kadir tweets back, the sad reality, Germany hasn't, but no European country has. So for those of you at home, we want to hear what your thoughts are on this subject. Tweet us. Use the hashtag AJStream.
Now you can see him sitting right beside Malika. He is Pete Simi, and the reason we have Pete Simi on is because he's the Associate Professor at the University of Nebraska and Advisory Board Member of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism. Peter, welcome to the stream.
Thanks for having me.
The stream is a social media community with its own daily TV show, and you know what that means, of course. It means that your ideas could be turned into 4 programs. So if there's a topic that you think that we should cover, get in touch with us directly. This is how to do it. Go online to streamaljazeera.com/about, and there on the right-hand side, I'm just doing it right now, you can find our Twitter handles. There's Malika's there. All of the producers, just tweet us your story, and it could be on the stream.
My name is Roida Mustafa. I'm from Kurdistan and a political activist, and I'm in the stream.
The trial of a German neo-Nazi group accused of killing immigrants over a period of 10 years has sparked a public debate about racism and right-wing extremism. 5 defendants are on trial in Germany's biggest Nazi-linked case since 1945. Beate Schäper, believed to be the last surviving member of the National Socialist Underground, or NSU, and 4 others are being charged with being involved in the murder of 8 Turks, 1 Greek, and a policewoman. They're also accused of 2 bombings in immigrant areas in the city of Cologne and 15 bank robberies. German Chancellor Angela Merkel called the crimes a national disgrace and asked for stronger measures to combat right-wing extremism. But relatives of the victims want more. They want to know why authorities failed to investigate the possibility that right-wing extremists were involved. Angry German Turkish community members are even accusing authorities of institutionalized racism. And many wonder how, in a country so deeply affected by its Nazi past, the group escaped detection for so long. So today we ask, has Germany done enough to address right-wing extremism? To help answer this question, we're joined from Munich by Dr. Vural Ünlü. He's head of the Turkish community in Bavaria. And in Berlin, Barbara Yon. She's the German government's ombudsman for the NSU victims' families. Barbara, Vural, welcome to the stream. Now, with a conversation like this where we're talking about potentially institutionalized racism in Germany, we really wanted to reach out to the German Ministry of Interior. We did. They got back to us and they said because of the ongoing trial, they couldn't take part in this conversation, but they did want to send us a statement. And this is the main gist of the statement. Have a look at this. Right-wing extremism, expressed in the form of intolerance, racism and xenophobia, constitutes a serious threat to peaceful coexistence in a democratic society. This is why confronting and combating right-wing extremism continues to be a high priority for the federal government. So let's get straight to the trial that's really caused this conversation to happen and go to Barbara. Barbara, this trial and these crimes have been described as the worst neo-Nazi crime since 1945. As representative of the families, can you give us some insight into what happened to their family members?
Well, what happened is that first they lost their beloved father or brother or their husband, and after this what happened was that the police itself directed the crime to their families because they had in mind that when it comes to such a murder, they themselves are in a milieu situation. They are probably in a mafia situation, and there must be some honor killings or there must be drug dealing, because the experience of many policemen is when we deal with immigrants, they deal with perpetrators normally, and therefore they thought, well, they might have been involved into these crimes, and that was a terrible thing, because this alienated these people from the surrounding, from the neighborhood, and sometimes even from family members. And it was one of the worst parts, and it took 10 years until it was discovered that there was this NSU cell, what we call this terror cell, who did the murders, and now things have become better. They improved, but the process is still going on. The trial just opened, and it will last for at least 1 or 1.5 years until there is a final to it.
Vural, I can't even begin to imagine what it must be like to be in an immigrant community where murders are happening. Now that the trial is underway, how would you describe the atmosphere, the feelings amongst the Turkish immigrants in Germany?
Well, of course, we were really horrified to find out about the scope of these crimes, especially here in Bavaria, where the majority of the murders have taken place. And I mean, basically, it is horrendous, because, you know, these people were not really bright minds. They didn't have any, you know, education in camps, in terroristic camps. So we expect that there have been some kind of helping hands. We expect that there have been supporting structures that are still maybe active. So this is a major concern still for the people living for the Turks living in Germany, and especially the Turks living in Bavaria.
I want to show our audience a little clip that the investigators found from the NSU group. And it's a clip which just shows them boasting about their crimes. It's a Pink Panther cartoon, but embedded in that cartoon are some of the victims that have been murdered in the last 10 years. I really want to bring in Pete here, because you spent time with right-wing groups, neo-Nazi groups. How do you explain their mindset where they wanted to kill people that they don't even know?
Well, from their perspective, they're in the midst of what they call a race war. And whites are on the verge of extinction from their perspective. So there's this global genocide that's being executed against the white race. And in the near future, they believe that whites will cease to exist as a racial group. And so any type of violence that they engage in, they can justify as a form of self-defense, right? That they're taking out racial enemies in this war that they believe that they're caught up in.
Vural, if I just jump back to you in Germany, is it too big a leap to say, okay, so this one group has been tracked down, they've been killing people for the last decade. There's obviously some kind of racism, institutionalized racism in Germany.
Well, I mean, if you look at the history of investigative failures of this case, then yes, you can say that there are indications of this form of racism, especially as Barbara mentioned. They have not really, not even considered the possibility to investigate on the far right side. Whenever there has been evidence about, for example, a profiler from Munich has indicated that a right-wing terrorist may be in the background, they have neutralized these profiler statement report by making another profiler report which said exactly the opposite. So they never even allowed the idea that Nazis may be at work, and this is certainly of a concern and may fuel the thesis that there is some kind of institutional racism in the background.
Well, Barbara, we have a community member here on Twitter who just agreed with what Dr. Vural said. Political dissident says they only discovered the neo-Nazi link by pure accident, not through their actual process of criminal investigation. But Barbara, then we got this Facebook comment from a German. Elo says, there is no day passing without an official or unofficial reminding of World War II and the Holocaust. Sometimes we're fed up with it because it goes on and on and on. Because of that fact, Germany is always frightened of xenophobia and does everything not to seem like it. Does this reflect a perception that Germany has dealt with its past and is ready to move on? How true is that?
Well, of course, Germany is not a racist country in the sense that there are people in the public service or dealing as racist people, or the state sending out racial messages. Of course, Germany is very proud of remembering what it did during the Nazi time and giving a lot of attention to this, building big memorials. This is something they do, but it is very uncomfortable for the country to realize that racism, that hate crime, that extinction of some people because they are not Germans is still on the mind of some people, especially young people. And to deal with it is, as I already said, is not very comfortable. So they rather take it as well as something which some single individuals do. And we help them, we help people if they got involved into it, if they become victims of this, we help them to find out. But what is not done is really to fight it in an active way. I give you an example. For Switzerland, for example, Swiss, they have to deal with any kind of racial crime or what is said and is deemed to be a racial remark that has to be dealt with by the police. This is not the case here in Germany. We don't have such a law, and we don't have a committee on racism as they have it in Switzerland. So I think we really should focus on this, because racism is in our society, although we think it has gone with the Nazis, but it hasn't. It is in some parts of the civil society still.
As Barbara was speaking, you were nodding, Pete. What was she saying that actually resonated with you?
Well, a number of things. I think one of the things that this the second comment brings to light is this issue of kind of a fatigue, and you see a parallel to that here in the United States in terms of discussions about the legacy of slavery and racial hatred in the United States, where this kind of sense of, look, we've dealt with it, we've been there, it happened, yes, but now we're over it, and we're kind of this post-racial society. And I think this is a very easy way for people to kind of convince themselves that these problems don't continue to this day.
It's easy to watch this conversation and think, well, it's anecdotal and there might be just these very oddballs floating around. But the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Germany has actually been conducting a survey to gauge how many right-wing extremist attitudes there are amongst the German population. So earlier we spoke to Dr. Ralf Metzler. He's the head of a unit working on combating right-wing extremism, and he shared his most important findings. So have a listen to this.
What we found out in our research is, compared with 2010, there has been a decrease in Germany from 7.6 to 7.3%, but at the same time, the degree of compliance with right-wing items increased in Eastern Germany from 10.5 to 15.8%. And this is really a quite dramatical development. At least in 4 of our dimensions of right-wing extremism, we are measuring the highest degree of compliance is among the youngest group. And this also, for us, is a very clear signal that one has to change the tools, instruments, and to intensify the efforts to combat this kind of thinking.
So Pete's listening because he's an academic, so he's totally on board here. But I want to take this discussion down onto the street with you, Vural. So if you're in Germany and you're Turkish immigrant or Turkish descent, what are the everyday incidences of racism that you experience and many in your community are experiencing?
Well, it's all sorts of, daily forms of racism that you encounter. It's basically when you look for a job, when you are looking for a flat, when it's basically the issue of the promotion of your children in the German school system. So it's a multifaceted, issue of daily racism. Let me also give you one example, because we were just comparing the situation with the United States. Here in Munich, we had a very strange story of a primary school in Munich that was doing ethical segregation. So basically, they formed children according to whether they were, biologically German or basically migrants. So they had one school, one class, which was only made up of children with migration background, and one with pure biological German children. And so this is also this more or less the situation that we had in Alabama, in the southern states in the 60s. And this is a case that is only 2 years. That only is 2 years before today. So we still, daily racism on all forms of levels, unfortunately, at present in Germany.
Vural, that sounds like apartheid to me, a little bit.
Yeah.
Segregation.
Yes.
What are the Turkish community doing about it? I can't believe that you would just be sitting there being victims. How are you pushing back, or how are you helping the situation to get out of where it is now and push it forward?
Well, basically, let me come back to this case of ethical segregation. What we did is we made a conference and we invited the press, and what happened is that the situation got fixed. And I mean, this is the responsibility of all the migration-oriented associations, that whenever they find evidence of racism, that we voice these concerns and try to get them fixed.
Barbara, this is quite damning anecdotal information that we're getting and hearing here on the program. In terms of the German government's response, are you encouraged by it?
I didn't quite get your question. Am I encouraged by what? By what?
The German government's response or progress towards stamping out more kinds of institutionalized racism. If children are being separated at school, that's not just extreme gangs or groups. This is part of the institution.
Yeah, what Vural just talked about, giving this anecdotal evidence, is happening, but we didn't hear about this all over the country. I think it's terrible. It's unbelievable that it happened, and I'm glad that they could fix it. In Berlin, it would have. It wouldn't have been possible, because immediately we would have a big discussion. But Bavaria, I wouldn't say it's known for this kind of treatment. But I remember when the Turkish immigrants came in the 60s and 70s, they had their own classes because they thought these families are going back. So what they don't need is a good German language education, but they need a mother tongue education because they want to go back. So there might be still this feeling. But on the other hand, this is a paradox. Bavaria is the country with the least unemployment. So all the immigrants are nearly employed. Here in Berlin, we have an unemployment rate of 23%. And in the Turkish community, it's even higher. It's even more than 30%. So you have a very good economic situation in Bavaria, but you also have a perception that probably immigrants from special countries don't really belong to this society, and that is something which is widespread in Germany. I often can feel that many people think, okay, they are different from us, but they are so different that they don't really fit into our German society. And therefore we always deal with the concept of integration. It's not so much the concept of diversity, being a diverse society which keeps together or is kept together by its values, and therefore diversity is something we have to achieve to. We really have to learn that people, even if we are diverse, if they are different in religion and of course in their culture, they are Germans. And I think we are far way off in this kind of thinking.
Pete, Barbara raised a lot of good things there, and one of the things she talked about was the economy, and people online are weighing in about that. Kubra says, since the targeted groups and individuals are often of stigmatized lower classes, there's generally very little attention paid to this. Joseph says, want proof Europe didn't learn anything from World War II? Look at anti-immigrant hatred across Europe. Fascist parties are hugely popular. How much do socioeconomic issues underpin all of this?
It's a complicated picture. There is some evidence in Germany specifically that areas hardest hit in terms of economic conditions, in particular former Eastern Germany, which has experienced the greatest amount of economic dislocation, these where you see your greater numbers of right-wing extremists and neo-Nazis are in these areas. But more broadly speaking, it's not a simple relationship to where you have poor economic conditions and people that automatically means people join a far-right group. But it's certainly one factor that can help kind of fester. It's one of the things that these types of groups can also recruit around as well. So it helps them, identify people. These are the people taking your jobs. These are the people to blame. Join our group. We've got the answers.
And speaking of factors, Vural, we have a video comment here about the role of the media. Have a listen to this.
Well, instead of seeing the obvious signs of neo-Nazi terrorism, the police, the state, and the media harass the families and accuse the victims of having been part of criminal groups. The media portrayed these murders as kebab murders, which is an extremely racist way of pointing out that most of the victims came from Anatolia. I'm active in my Kurdish community here in Frankfurt, and so many of us are constantly observed by the police. We don't enjoy free speech. Our newspapers get busted. Leftists and migrants are always under suspicion, whereas Nazis do enjoy free speech. They even have a legal party. They can go on their hate marches, and people who try to block them get pepper sprayed. It's a shame if a democratic country doesn't recognize who's on the side of democracy and who isn't. I really hope that this opens the urgent debate about neo-Nazi terrorism in Germany.
So, Vural, is media playing a role in incitement?
Well, I mean, this term, the Döner killings, I think it was used first by the German tabloid Bild, and they basically took it back after they found out that it was not an adequate term. But I have to say that also the Turkish media have used this term, so it's not only the German media that are guilty or that can be blamed for this, relatively unsensible form of dubbing these murders. But you can see this kind of form of semantic racism going also through the case. For example, the special commission that was formed to investigate the killings was called. Yes.
Right, would you take a pause for us just for a moment, because I have a feeling that you're going to go into a really interesting conversation, and I don't want to truncate it. So I want you to pause for a moment. We're going to come back in the online show, and that's the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. If you want to hear what Vural is about to say next, if you want to hear about Barbara's take on the government in Germany and what they're doing about racism, and Pete Simi's been undercover with right-wing racist groups in Berlin, you'll have to stay tuned to the online post show. Next week, we'll be looking at self-radicalization via the internet, other so-called terrorist manuals. Should they be banned? Join us in the next edition of The Stream, and we will see you online. It's good to see you on the Stream's online post show. We've been talking about the landmark neo-Nazi trial in Germany, which has sparked public debate about racism and right-wing extremism in the country. Our guests today are Pete Simi. He's a professor at the University of Nebraska and an advisory board member at the Center for Study of Hate and Extremism. We're also joined by Barbara Yon, the German government's ombudsman for the NSU victims' families, and Dr. Vural Ünlü, the head of the Turkish community in Bavaria. Where were we before we got interrupted, Vural? You were just about to start a story, and we just moved it into the post-show so we could get the full story.
Well, basically it was on the issue of semantic racism. And the point was that also the special commission that was commissioned to, investigate the issue was called Special Commission Bosphorus, which is the Straits in Istanbul. So it also showed from the denomination of the special commission that the main perspective was on organized crime. The main perspective was to investigate it within the Turkish community. And so that the perspective of right-wing extremism was shut down.
How can you be so calm when this is happening to your community? You're very calm, you're very measured, and people in the Turkish community have been deliberately picked off and murdered. I'm impressed at your composure, basically.
We've really for years we have been talked on this issue, and it's something that we really try to take out the emotions, because otherwise it would be really difficult to discuss on a rational level. So I think it's a political debate that has to be undertaken in a sober, factual way, and we try to, although it's difficult, we try to, leave out the emotional undertones.
I just want to jump in and point out that certainly Germany's not alone in this problem of not taking looking more quickly at right-wing extremists as potential suspects. You look back at what happened in Norway with the Anders Breivik, the act of lone wolf terrorism. He killed dozens of people. The immediate assumption was that it was Al-Qaeda, and commentators immediately got on camera and started talking about why Al-Qaeda would have reasons to target Norwegians. And you see this thing across the Western world. I think is there's certain blinders in place when it comes to neo-Nazis and right-wing extremists.
People online are weighing in. Michael Payne says, economic situation, nationalism, threat of multiculturalism through immigration has helped create or expand neo-Nazism. That's something we were talking about during the main portion of the show. But he gets a response on Twitter from Elena, who says, this is a big shame for our country. But actually, we're a very multicultural country with a high diversity, and these killings don't reflect us. So, Pete, are these the fringe of the fringe, the ones who are actually going out and committing killings? Do they represent a significant minority?
I would describe it as a significant minority. I think fringe of the fringe is pretty accurate in that respect. You have a much larger world of neo-Nazis who are not, fortunately, going out and committing these types of acts of violence. And there's certainly a process by which folks unfortunately evolve from being participating in that world of neo-Nazism and then in some cases eventually engaging in acts of terrorism. Fortunately, most don't, though, who are involved in that world. But there is certainly, when we talk about fringe of the fringe, we should also not diminish the number of folks that are involved in this. We were talking a little bit about some numbers earlier, interesting numbers going back to 2008. Looking at 15-year-olds in self-reports in former Eastern Germany, 1 in 8 reported being affiliated or a member of a neo-Nazi faction, 1 in 20 across Germany. So not just a former Eastern Germany problem either, nationwide. 1 in 20 15-year-olds reporting that's pretty alarming.
Right.
We spoke earlier about the Friedrich Ebert Foundation that's trying to combat racism in Germany, and we spoke to Dr. Ralph Metzler. And we also asked him, okay, so what are the solutions? You've done the research, you know the extent of racism, and this is what he told us.
As you know, that the extremists are very much using the internet and the social media for their purposes. So we need to create some kind of counter narratives in order to promote our values, to promote democracy, and to combat all kinds of discrimination and of stigmatizing specific groups in order to overcome group-focused enmities and right-wing extremism.
Vural, as we begin to wind up our conversation, what would you say would be the solutions from the Turkish community to help reduce the amount of racism they're receiving in Germany?
Well, I mean, it's a multi-layered problem. It's, I think, as with all radicalization, it has to do with issues. So I think that the rise of far extremist of the right extremist terrorism.
Okay, Vural's Skype is freezing, which means that Pete, you're very much alive and unfrozen here in the studio. I did mention that you'd spent time with right-wing groups in Berlin. Just very briefly, just give us an insight into that. I would be scared stupid. How are you?
Yeah, throughout the course of my field work with neo-Nazis in the United States and to a lesser degree in Germany, fear was pretty much a constant. I was always scared going out and never knowing. I mean, it's a very volatile group of folks. A lot of times there's heavy amounts of alcohol that are consumed in the different kinds of gatherings that where they come together, whether it be at bars or whether it be at house parties.
Right.
And there's certainly plenty of precedent for them turning on outsiders and allowing access and then deciding after the fact that we don't really want this person around, and the person ends up getting beaten or worse. So I was scared on a regular basis.
And that's very honest. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. We're going to end this conversation now. It will continue online. You know how to get hold of us at AJ Stream on Twitter. But right now, let's look at some of the other stories Malika has been following.
A Disney scandal has drawn out the ugly side of cartoons. The media giant recently tried to trademark the phrase Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead, for a future animated movie. The phrase refers to a Mexican festival honoring the dead, and web users shared images like this one to protest what they consider the appropriation of a sacred tradition. Disney buckled to pressure and withdrew its patent applications after several petitions against the trademark received more than 30,000 signatures. Eastside LA tweeted, "Important victory tonight. Disney is no longer trying to copyright Dia de los Muertos. Our culture is not for sale." Our next lead takes a look at a new anti-homophobia campaign in the Arab world. It's spearheaded by the online magazine Aswat in the lead up to May 17th, the International Day Against Homophobia. Citizens across the Arab world are submitting pictures carrying solidarity messages. Messages like this one, which reads, "Homophobia has no religion. I am Muslim and I am against homophobia." And lastly, memes have become the weapon of choice for those debating renowned scientist Stephen Hawking, who joined an academic boycott of Israel. This one is in support of Hawking's position, while this widely shared meme asks the scientist to stop using the Israel-designed chip that allows him to speak. When we asked our community their thoughts on Hawking's boycott, Maine weighed in. "It will have a wide impact on the propaganda side of things. It won't change anything on the ground where it matters, though." Well, you can read more on all three of those stories on our website at stream.aljazeera.com. Femi?
There was so much to get into this conversation today. Pete, how did we do?
I enjoyed it.
You have to say that. Yeah, but you're not going to get home. Thank you so much for being part of our conversation. So we have Pete Simi. He's from the University of Nebraska. And the title of your job is what?
Associate Professor of Criminology.
Wow. Malika Vural and the community, thank you for being part of the conversation.
Of course,
also, Barbara Yorn, she's the German government's ombudsman for the NSU victims. That's in the ongoing trial that's going on in Germany right now. And he froze on Skype, but he's very much alive and well. Dr. Vural Ünlü, from the head of the Turkish community. Thank you all for joining us. Next week, self-radicalize via the internet. That's how investigators have described the Boston Marathon bombing suspects. Did you know that you could do that just by surfing online? And should these so-called terrorist training guides be censored? Let us know. I know you will. Thanks to all of our guests today, and you can see us online as always. Thank you.